On the morning of July 13th, 1980, what was supposed to be a joyous community event in the countryside turned into one of the most baffling mysteries in British history. Approximately 300 people, the vast majority of them children, suddenly collapsed during a marching band competition at the Hollinwell showground near Kirkby in Ashfield, Nottinghamshire. To this day, nobody can definitively explain what happened. The incident has been attributed to everything from pesticide exposure to mass hysteria to aliens, and despite multiple investigations spanning over 4 decades, a satisfying answer has never been reached. Kirkby in Ashfield is a small market town situated in what was once a thriving coal mining region of England's East Midlands. Every year, the community held the Hollinwell Show, which involved food vendors and entertainment in a local field. In 1980, the Forest League of Juvenile Jazz Bands organized a charity competition as part of the show, creating a junior brass and marching band event. Marching bands were a point of pride in the local community, and the competitions were taken seriously by children and adults alike. Children would dress in elaborate majorette uniforms, wear sashes adorned with the medals from previous victories, and spend weeks rehearsing their routines. On the morning of July 13th, coaches began arriving at the showground from towns across the East Midlands, some traveling from as far as 40 miles away. Around 500 children from 11 different bands filed off the buses. The showground itself was bustling with activity. The event was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m., and children lined up in formation with instruments in hand, ready to march in a street parade before being judged on their music and marching. By all accounts, it started like any other competition day. The first sign that something was wrong came at approximately 10:30 a.m. A child near the front of one of the bands wobbled, lost her balance, and dropped to the ground. At first, the adults nearby assumed the girl had simply fainted from standing too long in the sun. Someone moved to help her up, but within moments another child went down, then another, then several more in quick succession. Children began collapsing across the field in clusters, and the collapses spread outward in what multiple witnesses described as a wave, as though an invisible force was sweeping through the crowd and dropping people where they stood. Within minutes, dozens of children were on the ground. Some had fainted outright and lay motionless on the grass. Others were doubled over, clutching their stomachs and crying out in pain. Some were vomiting, a few were convulsing. Others sat dazed, rubbing their eyes and complaining that their vision was blurry or that their eyes stung as if something had been sprayed into them. Children who were still standing looked around in wide-eyed confusion, unsure of what was happening or whether they were about to be struck too. Several victims and bystanders reported detecting a strange smell or taste in the air shortly before the symptoms took hold. Some described the odor as bleach-like, sharp, and chemical. Others compared it to onions, a pungent scent that seemed to hang in the air at ground level. One witness described the chest pains that accompanied the smell as feeling like exposure to nerve gas. Whether these reports were evidence of a real chemical presence in the air or a trick played on the mind has never been determined. As mentioned, while the bulk of the collapses were children, a little over a dozen adults also fell ill, experiencing many of the same symptoms as the kids. Even more unsettling, at least 2 babies were affected. One mother looked down at her infant and was horrified to discover the baby's skin was covered in blisters. The involvement of babies was a detail that would later complicate attempts to explain the incident, specifically arguments for mass hysteria. A baby cannot observe other people fainting and subconsciously reproduce the behavior. If babies were genuinely affected, something physical was happening to them, not something psychological. The collapses continued for an indeterminate period, though the worst of it appears to have occurred within a roughly 30 to 45 minute window beginning around 10:30. By the time emergency services had fully mobilized and begun treating and evacuating the victims, the rate of new collapses had slowed, but the damage was done. Officers helped to establish a perimeter and manage the crowds of panicked parents who were surging onto the field. As ambulances arrived, paramedics began the process of loading children onto stretchers and into the backs of the vehicles. The process was agonizingly slow given the number of victims. Each ambulance could carry only a limited number of patients, and with hundreds of people affected, it quickly became clear that a single hospital would not be able to absorb the volume of victims. Thus, a decision was made to distribute the victims across multiple facilities. In total, 259 people were transported by ambulance from the Hollinwell showground to 4 different hospitals. Queen's Medical Center in Nottingham, one of the largest teaching hospitals in the United Kingdom, received the bulk of the cases. Additional patients were routed to King's Mill Hospital in Mansfield, Chesterfield Royal Hospital, and Nottingham City Hospital. All 4 facilities were placed on Red Alert, a designation reserved for major emergencies that signaled to staff that an extraordinary influx of patients was imminent and that normal operations should be adjusted accordingly. Within hours, most of the 259 patients were well enough to be discharged. However, not everyone recovered so quickly. 9 children were kept overnight at their respective hospitals for further observation. The details of these 9 children's specific conditions have not been extensively documented in publicly available sources, but the fact that they required overnight hospitalization indicates that for at least a small subset of victims, the effects of whatever happened at Hollinwell were more significant. In the immediate aftermath, Ashfield District Council launched a formal investigation alongside local police and medical officers. The inquiry examined an exhaustive list of potential causes. Food and water contamination were the first suspects. Investigators collected samples of everything consumed at the event and tested the local water supply. Water companies quickly confirmed that the supply was not contaminated. Food samples revealed no bacterial impurities. Additionally, many attendees who ate and drank the same items suffered no ill effects whatsoever, effectively ruling out poisoning through consumption. Heat and exhaustion were also considered, given that many children had traveled long distances early that morning. However, the weather on July 13th was described as warm but not intensely hot, and the collapses began occurring before the children would have had time to become significantly overheated. Heat stroke was ruled out. Deliberate sabotage was investigated as well. Authorities tested for the presence of drugs or alcohol in the food and water, wondering if someone had spiked consumables. No evidence of any deliberate interference was found. Gas leaks and industrial fumes were explored next. A plastics factory operated a few miles from the showground, leading some to suspect fumes might have drifted toward the event. However, the wind direction on the day was blowing the wrong way for this to be feasible. Radio waves were investigated after a man in Scotland phoned the police to suggest that high-frequency transmissions might be responsible. A high-frequency radio transmitter was indeed found near the showground. However, investigators could not establish any mechanism by which radio waves would produce the physical symptoms observed, and the theory was set aside. As each possible explanation was debunked, officials gradually leaned toward mass hysteria as the only possible reasoning. Symptoms derived from mass hysteria are real and not faked, but they originate from psychological and social processes rather than an external toxin or pathogen. Common symptoms of documented outbreaks include fainting, nausea, headaches, abdominal pain, dizziness, and more. These outbreaks tend to affect women and children disproportionately, are typically short-lived, and frequently occur in institutional settings such as schools, factories, or organized events. The Hollinwell incident fit many of these criteria. The children were gathered in a high-pressure competitive environment, and many were anxious about performing, and they were tired from early morning travel. An outbreak primed by a combination of these details was entirely plausible to investigators. The rapid recovery of most victims also aligned with this theory. Once removed from the showground and the group dynamic that fueled the contagion, the symptoms subsided quickly. However, this conclusion was fiercely contested. Parents and survivors were offended by the implication that the symptoms were somehow imagined or fabricated. Dennis Skinner, the Labour MP for Bolsover and one of 3 members of Parliament who called for a government investigation, called the verdict, quote, "an insult to the intelligence and another cover-up by the establishment." Critics of the theory pointed to several inconsistencies, the primary one being the affected babies. Infants are far too young to participate in social contagion or psychological mimicry. Physical symptoms like sore eyes, irritated throats, and strange chemical tastes also suggested exposure to an irritant rather than a psychological phenomenon. Unconfirmed reports of horses falling ill further undermined a purely psychological explanation. Over the decades, a range of additional theories has surfaced, some more plausible than others. A doctor suggested the incident might have been triggered by the Coxsackie virus, which causes hand, foot, and mouth disease and primarily affects children. The virus was reportedly active in the local area at the time. One mother reported looking down to see her baby covered in blisters, which is consistent with this type of infection, but the theory was never confirmed through testing. In what was perhaps the most bizarre development, overseas Associated Press reports referenced an invasion from outer space. Police actually investigated reports of a UFO landing in a field adjacent to the showground. No evidence of any landing was found, but the fact that authorities pursued the lead illustrated how desperate they were for answers. One of the more unsettling aspects of the incident is what happened in the days that followed. 3 days after the event, 4 people in Worksop, a town not far from the showground, reportedly suffered symptoms similar to those experienced at Hollinwell. The following weekend, one of the bands that had originally been affected experienced another episode. These additional occurrences deepened the mystery and raised further questions about whether the cause was environmental, infectious, or psychological. Perhaps even more striking is a nearly identical event that occurred 8 years before Hollinwell. In 1972, at Hazelrig in Northumberland, 168 children at another marching band festival collapsed. Many of those children and several adults complained of sharp abdominal pains that seemed to subside once they were removed from the field. A doctor who treated the victims noted that, quote, they were all frightened and bewildered, many of them believing they had been poisoned. The similarities between the two events are difficult to ignore, yet no connection between them has ever been established. Lauren Spierer was born on January 17, 1991, to Charlene and Robert Spierer. She grew up in Scarsdale, New York, a suburb in Westchester County. Her father was an accountant, and she was raised alongside her older sister, Rebecca. Lauren graduated from Edgemont High School in 2009, and by all accounts, she was an outgoing, well-liked young woman. Her mother later recalled receiving a letter from a childhood friend's parent who said her daughter had once been jealous of Lauren's popularity, but when the girl was struggling, Lauren was the one who reached out and helped. She was active in the Jewish community and had spent a spring break planting trees in Israel on behalf of the Jewish National Fund. In the fall of 2009, Lauren enrolled at Indiana University in Bloomington, where she declared a major in textiles and apparel merchandising. Lauren had met her boyfriend Jesse Wolf, as well as her friend Jay Rosenbaum, years earlier at Camp Tawanda, a summer camp in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Through that same camp network, she became connected to a broader circle of friends from the East Coast who also ended up at the same university. She lived in an upscale, recently built apartment complex called Smallwood Plaza, located at 9th Street and College Avenue in downtown Bloomington. Many of her friends lived nearby at another complex called 5 North Townhomes at 11th and Morton Streets. These buildings sat in the heart of the student nightlife district, a few blocks from popular bars and surrounded by security cameras. On the evening of Thursday, June 2nd, 2011, Indiana University's campus population had thinned out considerably as most students had gone home, but a number of them remained in town, either taking summer classes or simply lingering around. Lauren was one of them. She had just finished her sophomore year and was staying in her apartment, where she lived on the 5th floor with her roommate Hadar Tamir. That evening, Lauren got dressed in a white tank top layered under a white blouse paired with black pants. She left Smallwood Plaza sometime around midnight with David Rohn, a friend and fellow student who also lived in her building. The two walked north a few blocks to the 5 North apartment complex. This was where many of Lauren's friends lived. The buildings at 5 North were arranged around a central courtyard and were popular among students from the East Coast, many of whom knew each other through a shared connection to Camp Tawanda, a summer camp in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. At 5 North, Lauren and David joined a group of friends who were hanging out and drinking. Lauren had recently become friendly with Corey Rossman, a student she had met just days earlier at the Indianapolis 500 race over Memorial Day weekend. The two had hit it off and spent time together that evening. At some point during the night, David decided to head home. He walked back to Smallwood Plaza around 12:30 a.m. on June 3rd and stayed in for the rest of the night. His attorney would later confirm that David voluntarily took an FBI-administered polygraph examination and showed no signs of deception. At approximately 1:45 a.m., a surveillance camera captured Lauren entering Kilroy Sports Bar, a well-known establishment about 3 blocks south of 5 North. Lauren used a fake ID card to get past the doorman as she was 20 years old at the time. Witnesses inside the bar later described Lauren as being very intoxicated. She was visibly unsteady on her feet and appeared to have been drinking heavily before she even arrived. According to later accounts, Lauren had consumed a significant amount of alcohol throughout the evening. There were also reports, corroborated by statements her friends later made to investigators, that Lauren had snorted cocaine and crushed up tablets of Klonopin, a benzodiazepine used to treat anxiety and seizure disorders, at some point during the night. She spent roughly 40 minutes inside Kilroy's. During that time, she apparently took off her shoes while on the sand-covered patio and left them behind. She also left her cell phone at the bar. At 2:27 a.m., surveillance footage captured Lauren exiting Kilroy's with her friend Corey Rossman. She was barefoot. The two began walking north on College Avenue, back toward the area where both of their apartments were located. The walk from Kilroy's to Smallwood Plaza was only a few blocks, and there were many other people out making their own way home from bars that were beginning to close. As Lauren and Corey approached Smallwood Plaza, a passerby named Zach Oakes noticed them. Oakes observed that Lauren appeared extremely intoxicated and stopped to ask if she was all right. The duo entered the complex at approximately 2:30 a.m. and took the elevator up to the 5th floor. What happened next became one of the most debated and puzzling moments of the entire evening. According to accounts pieced together by investigators and later reported in detail by journalist Sean Cohen in his 2024 book, someone punched Corey in the face in the 5th floor hallway. The blow was hard enough that his attorney later suggested it may have given him a concussion, and Corey himself claimed he could not remember much of what happened after that point. The identity of the person who threw the punch was never officially confirmed by police. Some accounts suggested it may have been connected to a dispute over Lauren, possibly involving jealousy or a confrontation between young men who had been drinking. Others speculated it could have been a random altercation. Regardless of who threw the punch or why, the interaction came with consequences as Lauren never entered her apartment. Instead of going inside, Lauren and Corey turned around and left Smallwood Plaza. Her father, Robert, would later express deep frustration about this moment, publicly asking why Corey did not simply walk Lauren to her door, which was only steps away, and make sure she got inside. Instead, the two left the building and headed back out into the night. At 2:48 a.m., a security camera captured Lauren entering an alley that ran between College Avenue and Morton Street. 3 minutes later, another camera recorded her emerging from the other end of the alley and walking toward an empty lot near the 5 North complex. A second person was visible with her in the footage, though police never publicly confirmed who it was. Along this route, Lauren's keys and a small coin purse were later recovered by investigators. At some point during this walk, cameras appeared to show Corey carrying Lauren over his shoulder before ultimately arriving at his apartment at 5 North shortly after emerging from the alley. His roommate, Michael Beth, was inside. When Corey and Lauren came through the door, Michael could see that Corey was in terrible condition. He was extremely intoxicated, possibly concussed from the punch he had taken, and he vomited on the apartment carpet shortly after arriving. Michael later told investigators that he tried to convince Lauren to stay at the apartment and sleep it off. He could see she was in no condition to be walking around alone at that hour, but according to his account, Lauren was insistent on leaving. Michael said he went upstairs briefly, and when he came back down, Lauren was gone. A neighbor later confirmed that she had seen or heard Lauren in the area around that time. It was now approximately 3:30 a.m. and Michael called his neighbor Jay Rosenbaum, who was also a mutual friend of Lauren's, telling him that he was concerned about Lauren's whereabouts. Jay's apartment was nearby and he invited Lauren in after spotting her. Inside, Jay noticed that Lauren had a bruise under her left eye. He asked her about it, but she apparently could not explain how she got it. While Lauren was in his apartment, 2 phone calls were placed from Jay's phone. One went to David, who was back at Smallwood Plaza, and the other went to another friend. Neither call was answered and no voicemails were left. According to Lauren's roommate Hadar, Jay later told her that Lauren herself had placed the calls because she had left her own cell phone at Kilroy's and was trying to reach someone to come get her. At approximately 4:30 a.m., Lauren wanted to leave, so Jay walked her to his door and watched her leave. He claimed the last place he saw her was at an intersection, headed south in the direction of Smallwood Plaza. The distance between that intersection and her apartment was only a few blocks, a walk that would take roughly 5 minutes. However, Lauren never arrived at her apartment and was never seen again. Just minutes after she left Jay's apartment, a homeless man in the area reportedly heard a woman scream somewhere west of the intersection where Lauren had been walking. Speculation about the man's identity focused on a well-known local transient named Franklin Crawford, who went by the nickname Road Dog. Crawford died just days after Lauren's disappearance, which prevented investigators from conducting a thorough follow-up interview with him. Whether the scream was connected to Lauren or was simply a coincidence on a late night in a college town remains unknown. A separate piece of evidence that drew significant public attention was surveillance footage showing a white pickup truck that passed through the area where Lauren was last seen twice during the early morning hours. The truck appeared to have something in its bed, which members of the public speculated could have been a body. Police investigated the vehicle aggressively and eventually identified the driver. But on June 19, 2011, Bloomington police announced that the driver had been ruled out as a suspect and that the truck had no connection to Lauren's disappearance. Later that day, on June 3rd, Lauren's boyfriend Jesse grew concerned after his text went unanswered. An employee at Kilroy's eventually contacted him to say that Lauren's phone had been left at the bar. Jesse met Lauren's roommate on campus to get a key to enter their apartment, but was shocked to find it empty. Friends subsequently reported Lauren missing to the Bloomington Police Department around 4:30 p.m. That evening, Lauren's father, Robert, received a call from his other daughter, Rebecca, relaying the news. Robert and Charlene immediately started calling hospitals and clinics in the Bloomington area. They arrived in Bloomington the next day and stayed until August. The Herald Times was the first outlet to break the story, and within days, national media swarmed the area. On June 5th, 2 days after the disappearance, a formal search team was assembled. Searchers checked Lauren's apartment for a second time, combed the surrounding blocks, and began expanding outward. Investigators sent dive teams into Griffey Lake, a reservoir located about 2 miles north of campus, and coordinated searches of other waterways in the area, but nothing was found. The next day, hundreds of volunteers showed up from the Smallwood Plaza complex. The volunteer searches were conducted 3 times per day beginning June 6th. Teams fanned out in organized grids, checking wooded areas, ditches, parking garages, construction sites, dumpsters, and abandoned buildings. The searches were physically grueling, often conducted in high heat and humidity. Despite the enormous effort, no trace of Lauren was found. On June 7th, Lieutenant Bill Parker, the lead detective on the case, held a press conference. He addressed the media with blunt honesty, stating that when a young woman disappears off a street corner at 4:30 in the morning with no shoes on after a night of heavy drinking, foul play was certainly a possibility. That same day, police took the step of breaking down the door to Smallwood Plaza's security office with a battering ram in order to seize surveillance footage from the building's cameras. By June 9th, the search had expanded to include lakes and bodies of water in neighboring counties and was actively enhancing and investigating surveillance footage. By June 29th, the organized daily search efforts officially ended, but investigators continued to follow up on any leads. In August of the same year, investigators made the decision to search the Sycamore Ridge landfill, located near Pimento in Vigo County, approximately 70 miles southwest of Bloomington. The theory was that if Lauren's body had been placed in a dumpster or trash receptacle in the Bloomington area shortly after her disappearance, it could have ended up buried in this landfill. FBI agents and investigators spent 9 consecutive days at Sycamore Ridge sifting through more than 4,100 tons of garbage. Teams worked in oppressive summer heat, sorting through layers of decomposing waste, looking for any trace of human remains, clothing, or personal effects. Cadaver dogs were brought in to assist. The FBI used records from the waste management company to identify the specific section of the landfill where trash from Bloomington collected in the days following Lauren's disappearance would have been deposited, and they concentrated their efforts there. After 9 days of searching, investigators found nothing connected to Lauren. From early on in the investigation, several of Lauren's friends became persons of interest. This included Jay, Corey, and at least 10 other unnamed individuals. Due to a combination of media reporting, internet sleuthing, and gossip, the men Lauren was with that night became the focus of intense public scrutiny. Lauren's parents expressed deep frustration that the men hired attorneys quickly and refused to take police-administered polygraphs. Robert noted that Corey, who had spent the most time with Lauren in her final hours, was the one person who flatly refused to speak with the family or their private investigators. The men's attorneys pushed back, stating their clients had been interviewed repeatedly, submitted DNA, passed private polygraphs, and turned over more than 130 days of cell phone records. One attorney told reporters that calling the men uncooperative was simply not accurate. However, because the case remained open, police never formally cleared anyone, which left the cloud of suspicion lingering indefinitely. Lauren's boyfriend was also questioned. When asked about his whereabouts that night, he said he was home watching the NBA Finals and went to bed around 2:30 a.m. His roommate corroborated this. No witnesses placed Jesse out that night. He helped with searches in the first couple of days, but then his parents arrived and took him home. He declined on-camera interviews, but maintained he cooperated with police. Former FBI cold case agent Brad Garrett, who worked with the family's private investigators, later stated that while he was not suggesting Jesse did anything, he was not entirely comfortable that he could fully account for his whereabouts in the early morning hours. A crucial detail that became central to the case is that Lauren had been diagnosed with long QT syndrome, a rare hereditary defect in the heart's electrical system. The condition affects the heart's ability to recharge between beats and can trigger dangerously rapid, chaotic heart rhythms called arrhythmias. In severe cases, it can cause sudden cardiac arrest, even in young, otherwise healthy individuals. Many sudden deaths among young athletes have later been attributed to undiagnosed long QT syndrome. Drugs, stimulants, and excessive alcohol are all known to potentially trigger a fatal cardiac event in people with this complication. According to statements Jay made to investigators, Lauren consumed alcohol, coke, and crushed up Klonopin tablets on the night she disappeared. Police also found a small amount of drugs in Lauren's room after her disappearance. 9 months before she vanished, Lauren had been arrested on charges of public intoxication and illegal consumption. Jesse's mother alleged that Lauren had been asked to leave Camp Tawanda years earlier due to drug use. Robert acknowledged his daughter's heart condition and said he did not know exactly how it factored into the events of that evening, but that she was certainly susceptible to something catastrophic happening if she had consumed drugs. The most prominent theory is that Lauren suffered a fatal drug overdose or cardiac event, likely triggered by the interaction between her condition. Where this theory takes an interesting turn is when those around her possibly panicked after her collapse. It's not unreasonable to think that they feared criminal liability for supplying her with illegal substances. Instead of calling law enforcement, her body may have been disposed of. This theory gained significant traction when a Bloomington police spokesman confirmed at a June 2011 press conference that investigators had received information along those lines. It was further bolstered by the jailhouse account of an inmate named Corey Hammersley, a former IU student who was serving a 24-year sentence for shooting at police. Another inmate claimed that during a card game, Lauren's face appeared on a television, and Hammersley looked up and said he knew the guys who did it. The inmate alleged Hammersley described a scenario in which Lauren was at a house party where people were drinking and taking ecstasy. She overdosed, and the panicked group took her body to the Ohio River to hide it. Hammersley denied involvement when confronted by investigators and said he did not want to be associated with the case. Former FBI agent Brad Garrett stated that this theory was the one he found most compelling. He noted that investigators often overcomplicate cases, and the simplest explanation was often the correct one. Critics of this theory find it unlikely that multiple young adults had the composure and willpower to not crack under pressure for over a decade withholding information. Another popular theory is that a stranger encountered Lauren in her extremely vulnerable state and abducted her. Bloomington is surrounded by rural and wooded terrain, and a predator familiar with the area could have concealed evidence easily. An individual named Robert Bodine Strange, a former enforcer for the Sons of Silence motorcycle gang, was investigated after officials received a tip. An online message from one of Strange's relatives alleged he had shot Lauren in a dispute over drugs and buried her on his property. Strange denied everything, and after further investigation, officials concluded the tip was likely planted by people with grudges against Strange. Lauren's parents publicly stated that they did not believe the disappearance was a random abduction. Her mother, Charlene, said she believed someone Lauren knew was responsible for the events of that evening. In April 2015, police investigated a possible link to the murder of another IU student named Hannah Wilson. Wilson went missing after visiting Kilroy's, the same bar Lauren had been at, and her body was found the next morning in Brown County. Daniel Messel was convicted of the murder after his cell phone was found near Wilson's body. Brown County prosecutor Ted Adams stated in 2017 that he believed Daniel could be connected to Lauren's disappearance. However, investigators officially concluded in July 2015 that the two cases were unrelated. Eventually, Lauren's parents filed civil lawsuits against Corey Rossman, Jay Rosenbaum, and Michael Beth, accusing them of negligence. The suits allege the men supplied Lauren with alcohol when she was already visibly intoxicated and then failed to ensure she returned safely to her apartment, which likely contributed to her death. The family hoped the legal process would compel the defendants to reveal more information about that night, including subpoenaing private cell phone and academic records spanning over 4 months before and after the disappearance. In 2013, federal judge Tanya Walton Pratt dismissed the suit against Michael, finding he had no duty of care for Lauren. In 2014, Pratt dismissed the remaining suits against Corey and Jay. The judge wrote that without evidence, it would be impossible for a jury to determine whether whatever happened to Lauren was a natural and probable consequence of her intoxication or the result of some other intervening act. The Spierer family appealed the ruling, but the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the dismissal in August 2015. Over the years, the discovery of unidentified human remains in Indiana and surrounding states repeatedly sparked hope and headlines, only to end in disappointment. In April 2012, skeletal remains found in southern Illinois were confirmed not to be Lauren. In April 2016, human remains found on Rogers Street in Bloomington on private property belonging to a convicted sex offender were also ruled out. In March 2025, human remains were discovered at a construction site near I-69 and Bloomington North High School, immediately sparking speculation on social media. Then in May of the same year, the Monroe County Coroner's Office identified the remains via dental records as those of John Baker Jr., a 40-year-old man who had been reported missing in March 2022. As of March 2026, Lauren Spierer has been missing for nearly 15 years. Her body has never been found, no arrests have been made, and no confirmed sighting has ever occurred. The Bloomington Police Department has investigated over 30 new tips and leads in the past 2 years and has stated the case remains very active. Heather Kullorn was born on March 9, 1987 in St. Louis, Missouri, to her mother Christine. Very little is known about Heather's biological father. By all available accounts, he had not seen Heather or been involved in her life since she was very young, and his name rarely appears in any reporting on the family. Christine raised Heather and her older brother Matthew largely on her own. Those who knew Heather described her as boisterous. She was energetic and displayed maturity well beyond her age. One relative was quoted as saying that Heather was 12 going on 30. She would tell you exactly what she thought of you without hesitation, and that she had no interest in sitting quietly in the background. Though Heather's father was absent, the girl was far from isolated. Christine's family was deeply embedded in the St. Louis area, and several of Heather's aunts and uncles lived nearby. Heather spent a considerable amount of time with her cousins, and the kids would often play together for hours. In the fall of 1998, she entered the 6th grade at Blow Middle School in South St. Louis. For a while, things appeared to be progressing normally, but in early 1999, Heather fell ill. The symptoms persisted, and after a series of medical visits, doctors diagnosed her with type 1 diabetes. Her life was forever changed. Heather would now require twice daily insulin injections and would need to check her blood sugar levels 4 times per day. For a 12-year-old who thrived on independence and spontaneity, the rigid medical routine was a major adjustment. The diabetes took a toll on her attendance at school. Heather missed several weeks of classes, leading school officials to determine she would need to repeat the 6th grade. It was a setback, but not one that seemed to dampen her spirit. She was expected to return in the fall and try again. Interestingly, while the diagnosis was a hardship, it had a silver lining within the family dynamic. According to Christine, the illness actually brought mother and daughter closer together. The daily routine of monitoring blood sugar and administering insulin injections created a rhythm of dependency and care between them. Christine was deeply attentive to Heather's medical needs, and the shared responsibility further strengthened their bond. Around this same time, Heather began entering that volatile territory between childhood and adolescence. Christine acknowledged that her daughter was going through a bit of a rebellious streak, and the friction that comes with a preteen asserting her independence was beginning to surface in the household. The most notable incident involved a cigarette. Heather had been caught smoking, and the discovery caused quite a commotion. She was also experimenting with her appearance. She had started paying more attention to fashion, trying out different makeup looks and hairstyles. In one memorable incident, she attempted to pluck her eyebrows and somehow ended up shaving them off completely. Despite the minor rebellions, there was no indication that Heather was troubled in any serious way. She wasn't running with a dangerous crowd or failing out of school for behavioral reasons. She was, by all accounts, a normal kid navigating through her life. In the summer of 1999, an opportunity arose that appealed to both Heather and Christine. Family friends Dana Madden, age 23, and Christopher Herbert, age 34, lived in an apartment at Yale Avenue in Richmond Heights, a suburb situated just west of St. Louis. The couple had a connection to the Kullorn family that ran back several years. Herbert had previously dated Christine on and off before eventually meeting and settling down with Madden. Through that relationship, Herbert had become a familiar presence in Heather's life. Several people close to the family described him as being like an uncle to Heather. Not everyone shared that opinion, however. Some sources explained that while Heather surely viewed Herbert in this warm, familial way, Herbert himself could often seem cold or disinterested in the girl. The warmth, in other words, may have been more one-directional than it appeared. Heather's relationship with Madden was far less ambiguous. The two were genuinely close friends. In the spring of 1999, Madden and Herbert welcomed a baby daughter into their lives. The arrival of the infant created an immediate need for someone to watch the baby during the hours when neither parent was home. Madden worked overnight shifts at a nearby convenience store in St. Louis, meaning she was typically out of the apartment from around 10 p.m. until approximately 7:30 a.m. Herbert's schedule was less structured and less clearly defined, but he was frequently out of the apartment as well, often for extended periods. For Heather, the chance to babysit was exciting on multiple levels. She had always loved children, and the idea of being trusted to care for an infant on her own appealed to her desire for independence and responsibility. The arrangement was that Heather would stay at the Yale Avenue apartment and look after the child during the times when no one else was home. The understanding was that Heather would supposedly never be left alone for extremely long stretches of time. On Saturday, July 10th, 1999, Heather packed her things and moved into the apartment to begin what was planned as a week-long stay. The complex contained 7 units, each listed at approximately 450 square feet. The east side of the building faced Mitchell Avenue, and the rear of the complex provided access to several garages used by residents, as well as a basement area. The garages would become critically important to the investigation. They were accessible to multiple residents of the complex, and the rear entrance meant that people could come and go from the garage area without necessarily being visible from the front of the building or the courtyard. It was a layout that offered a degree of concealment. Mike Mason, a friend of Herbert's, lived in an apartment across the street from the complex. Mason was involved in maintaining and fixing up some of the apartments that were still in development at the building, and he occasionally hired Herbert as a handyman to assist with the work. Additionally, this area was ripe with drug activity. By all accounts, the first several days of Heather's stay at the apartment were uneventful. Christine maintained close and regular contact with her daughter throughout the week, calling to check in, making sure Heather had everything she needed, and most importantly, confirming that she was keeping up with her insulin injections and blood sugar monitoring. The apartment was just over 10 miles from Christine's place on Vermont Avenue, close enough that Christine could be there in under 15 minutes if an emergency arose. At no point during the stay did Heather express worry, fear, or discomfort. Christine later stated in multiple interviews that she firmly believed her daughter would have told her if she had witnessed anything criminal or dangerous happening at the apartment. By Thursday, July 14th, Heather had been staying at the apartment for roughly 4 days. That evening began like any other. Heather was inside with the baby. Dana Madden was preparing to leave for work. She would eventually leave around 10 p.m. and would not be expected home until approximately 7:30 the following morning. Herbert, the baby's father, was also present in the apartment when Madden left for work. According to Madden, the last time she personally saw Heather was that evening before she walked out the door. Madden said goodbye, left the apartment, and drove to her overnight shift. Investigators would later verify through her employer that Madden was indeed at work during the hours that followed. According to Herbert's initial account to the police, he did not stay in the apartment long after Madden departed. He told investigators that he left roughly half an hour after Madden. Herbert's reason for leaving would become one of the most scrutinized and contested elements of the entire investigation, because he never settled on a single story. In his first account given to police shortly after Heather was reported missing, he claimed he had left the apartment to drive a friend home, but investigators immediately noticed an obvious problem with this story. If Herbert had simply driven someone home, why had he been gone for approximately 6 hours? A ride home, even across town, should not have taken until well after 4 a.m. When pressed on this, Herbert abandoned his first story entirely and offered a second one. In this version, he said he had left the apartment to go hang out with a friend on the banks of the Mississippi River. This was a more plausible explanation for being gone for several hours, but it was still vague and difficult for investigators to confirm. Herbert did not initially provide specifics about which friend he was with, exactly where along the river they had been, or what they had been doing for so many hours. This second version would later change as well. During a subsequent round of questioning by the major case squad, Herbert stated he had been smoking methamphetamine with his friend along the banks of the Mississippi. But investigators still were not satisfied, because even this version did not fully align with other evidence they were gathering. The fourth and final version of Herbert's story came from court documents later obtained by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and it painted a dramatically different picture of his evening. In this account, Herbert told investigators that he had not gone to the river at all, at least not initially. Instead, he said he had been inside the apartment complex's garage that night, cooking illegal substances with an associate. According to this version, he left the garage at approximately 10:30 p.m. to obtain additional supplies, and he did not return to the apartment until roughly 6 hours later, at which point he discovered Heather was gone. This fourth story introduced an entirely new cast of characters and details. Herbert told police that the associate he had been cooking with was dating a woman who owned a red BMW. Herbert admitted that he had previously stolen both money and drugs from this vehicle. According to his statement, when he returned to the apartment complex that morning and found Heather missing, the woman, her boyfriend, and the red BMW were all gone from the area. Herbert also said that a note had been left behind telling him that they wanted back the merchandise he had stolen from them. Herbert was implying that Heather had been taken as a form of retaliation for his theft. The single most important eyewitness account from that night came from a neighbor in the apartment complex who stepped outside at approximately 2 a.m. to walk his dog. As he made his way back toward his apartment, the neighbor observed something that would become the cornerstone of the entire investigation. An unidentified man was exiting Herbert's apartment carrying what appeared to be a child. The child's upper body was concealed beneath a blanket, wrapped up as though sleeping. The witness noted that the child's legs were hanging out from beneath the blanket and that she was not wearing shoes. The man carrying her was described only as being of medium height. The reason that this was the only detail the witness could make out was because he was legally blind without his glasses. What he saw was essentially a blurred silhouette. Despite its limitations, the witness's account established a critical window. After the man carried the child out of the apartment, the infant was left completely alone inside. Multiple residents of the apartment complex would later tell police that they heard the sounds of a baby crying throughout the early morning hours. It was not until the crying continued without any sign of stopping that concern began to build among the neighbors. By the time authorities were eventually called to the scene at approximately 5 a.m., that baby had likely been alone and screaming for close to 3 hours. Herbert later described the moment he walked through the door, saying, "I just walked in the house and noticed she wasn't there. My baby was crying. Her shoes were lying on the floor. Nothing was touched, nothing was out of place, and Heather was gone." The claims that nothing was touched and nothing was out of place would prove to be directly contradicted by what investigators found when they arrived. But in that moment, Herbert's immediate action was to pick up the phone and call Dana Madden at work. He did not call Christine to ask if she had come to pick up her daughter, nor did he call the police. The exact content of that phone call has never been fully disclosed, and the two accounts that exist of it do not perfectly align. In one version, Herbert called Madden to ask if she might know where Heather had gone. Madden, unable to provide an answer and realizing the gravity of the situation, made the decision to hang up and call the police herself. In the other version, the phone call between Herbert and Madden devolved into an argument, and Madden hung up on Herbert before calling the police to report the girl missing. The first officers arrived at the apartment at approximately 5 a.m. Within the first hour, more than 40 officers were on the scene. Upon searching the apartment, investigators immediately noticed blood on the couch as well as a blood-stained rag nearby it. There were also bloodied pillows that had been stuffed behind a trash can as though someone had tried to conceal them. This blood was later confirmed to have belonged to Heather. Critically, the amount of blood discovered was not large enough for investigators to conclude that she had suffered a fatal wound. There was one additional bloodstain found outside the apartment in a small patch of grass behind the building. Investigators initially treated this as potentially significant, but a resident of the complex came forward and explained that the blood was his. He had been bitten by a dog earlier and had bled in that spot. This particular bloodstain was ruled unrelated to Heather's case. Police also noted that several items inside the apartment appeared to have been moved or displaced, though they did not publicly specify whether this indicated a struggle or whether items had been stolen. The one item they did confirm as missing was the white comforter with the floral design, which aligned perfectly with what the dog-walking neighbor had described seeing wrapped around the child being carried out earlier that morning. Investigators knocked on every door in the building and on neighboring streets, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. The multiple reports of a baby crying for hours confirmed that something had gone wrong inside the apartment well before Herbert returned, but apart from the previously mentioned sighting, no one else had directly witnessed a person removing a child from the building. Early on, Mike Mason became a person of interest. According to Mason's own recollection, Herbert arrived at his apartment accompanied by police officers, bluntly asking, "Is she in there?" Without resistance, Mason gave the officers permission to search his apartment. They did so thoroughly, but recovered no evidence connecting him to Heather's disappearance. Mason was subsequently administered a polygraph test, and he claimed that he passed it. Police, however, refused to comment on the results of any polygraph tests conducted during the case. This refusal to confirm or deny took on added significance when, roughly 2 weeks into the investigation, Chief Lowry publicly stated that their prime suspect, who was unnamed, had failed a polygraph. Whether that unnamed suspect was Mason, Herbert, or someone else entirely has never been confirmed or denied by investigators. What Mason was willing to discuss openly was the environment Heather had been exposed to during her visits to the apartment. Mason did not attempt to minimize or conceal the reality of what was happening around Heather. He was quoted as saying, "That girl had seen a lifetime of stuff." This formed the backbone of the primary investigative theory. Heather likely witnessed an illegal substance operation and the individuals involved. She represented a potential threat to everyone connected. One of the most haunting details Mason contributed to the case involved a discovery he made in the days following Heather's disappearance. He noticed that his vehicle's tow chains were missing from his car. Mason had not noticed them missing on the night of July 14th. But when he went to look for them shortly after and found them gone, a grim theory formed in his mind. Mason speculated that someone could have taken those chains, wrapped them around Heather's body, and used them to weigh her down before disposing of her in the Mississippi River. The theory was not as outlandish as it might initially sound. The Mississippi River was a recurring element throughout the case. If you recall, in one version of Herbert's recounts, he actually visited the same river. Mason's tow chain theory gained additional traction when, just 5 days after Heather vanished, police recovered a white blanket fitting the description of the comforter missing from the apartment. The blanket was found in a park approximately 10 miles from the apartment, situated near the banks of the Mississippi River. When the blanket was shown to Dana Madden, she told investigators it was not the same one that had been in her apartment. Police had no way to argue against this, but the discovery was noted as deeply curious. On July 28th, a rescue team conducted an operation to search the Mississippi River for any signs of Heather in the area near the park where the blanket had been found. The search turned up nothing. In subsequent months and years, cadaver dogs were brought to several locations along the riverbanks, and police also dragged a lake on a property that Herbert was known to frequent. None of these searches produced any meaningful evidence. One of the most intriguing but frustratingly sparse details in the case involves a couple from Sikeston, Missouri, a small city of roughly 17,000 people, approximately 160 miles south of St. Louis. According to an investigative report which drew on interviews with Mason, Madden, Herbert, and Major K Squad Commander Bill Baker, officials interviewed this couple as part of their initial investigation. The reason this couple drew attention was alarming. They had stopped by Herbert's apartment on the afternoon of July 14th, the same day Heather would vanish just hours later, to recover substance manufacturing equipment. Ultimately, investigators questioned the couple and ruled them out as suspects. The specific basis for this determination has never been publicly disclosed. The couple's visit nevertheless remains significant for what it reveals about the scope and nature of the drug operation that surrounded Heather. In the weeks and months following the disappearance, the behavior of Herbert, Mason, and Madden continued to trouble investigators. The main reason was that they continued to use illegal substances despite knowing that police were actively surveilling them. Both Mason and Madden have acknowledged in separate interviews conducted years later that their use affected how they processed and responded to what had happened to Heather. In an interview, Madden said, "When you are high, you don't think about things, and you wake up in the morning and you think, I'm going to have to deal with this stuff. So then you get more high." As for Mason, he was eventually arrested and convicted on federal drug charges and sentenced to 6 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Marion, Illinois. It was from behind those walls that he gave his most detailed interviews about the case and stated that he wanted to see the case move forward. He was quoted saying, "I would love to see this go to trial. I would love to be able to talk to someone about this." Moving on to Herbert, just 2 months after Heather was abducted in September, he was involved in an incident that resulted in second-degree arson charges. He was convicted and served a time at a medium security institution. He would go on to cycle in and out of the prison system on various charges over the following years. Herbert was reached out to for interviews but declined and said the following in a letter: "I don't think I can tell you any more than you already know. I have nothing to hide." Madden's path took her out of Missouri entirely, eventually settling in Illinois. She told a reporter that she still scanned the internet once a month, searching for any news about Heather. She maintained that she had no knowledge of what happened that night and expressed a hope that Heather would someday be found. When asked about her own theories on what might have happened, she offered a notably different perspective from Mason's. She pointed out that it was not common for a friend or acquaintance to randomly drop by the apartment unannounced. She suggested the possibility that Heather's abduction could have been the work of a stranger, noting that Heather used to play at a nearby park, and that perhaps someone had followed her back to the apartment complex from there. This theory, however, was largely at odds with the investigative consensus. It was stated publicly that the absence of screams pointed away from a stranger abduction and towards someone Heather knew and felt comfortable with. Mason agreed with this assessment. The evidence all supported the theory that Heather's abductor was someone familiar to her. By 2017, the year Heather's mother passed away, Detective Mike Brown participated in a radio interview in which he made a significant disclosure. Brown stated that investigators had two suspects they had been following for several years. He did not name them. He described them only as individuals who had been in and out of the prison system for various crimes over the years, and he confirmed that while investigators believed these two people were responsible for Heather's abduction and likely murder, they had never been able to gather sufficient evidence to make an arrest. In March 2002, the remains of a female child were discovered in a creek bed near St. Louis. Investigators initially believed they may have found Heather. Christine was unable to identify the clothing the victim had been wearing, and subsequent testing proved the remains did not belong to Heather. When Chief Jerry Rohr took over the Richmond Heights Police Department in 2023, he prioritized Heather's case and assigned his detective supervisor to the investigation. With improved technology, the department digitized hundreds of pieces of evidence to make them more easily accessible. In a significant development, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children contacted the department and offered to assist in retesting all DNA evidence using modern technology. Chief Rohr expressed cautious optimism, saying, "For the first time in a while, we're following up on what I would consider more credible leads than we've gotten in the past several years. These particular leads I'm kind of excited about. I would say that this is probably the most active that this case has been in over a decade."